All right, Steve Palmer here, Lawyer Talk Podcast Q&A. What is Lawyer Talk Podcast Q&A? Well, I tell you what, all we do, you go to lawyertalkpodcast.com and you can submit questions and I will give my best assessment or answer to your question. It's not legal advice. I'm just sort of giving comments on topics that people are interested in. And I've got one today. This one comes from Sarah. And she says, "Hi, Steve. In Ohio, if I refuse a breathalyzer test but request to take blood test instead, is that okay? Or can I be charged with a crime? Love the podcast." Thank you for listening, by the way. I think this is a great question, and I'm glad you love the podcast. We're going to keep bringing it to you. So this is a great question. I do another series in Ohio called the DUI 360, where I take topics like this and I sort of break them down, and I'm going to use this as a platform to do that. And I might even do some more in that other side of things too. But there's a couple of questions here. One is sort of buried in the weeds. So the first answer to your question is you have a right to, right's not the right word. You can refuse a test, a chemical blood test, urine test, or breath test in Ohio, right? You can refuse. So there's a consequence for that. So generally speaking, if you're on the side of the road and a police officer says, "Hey, I want you to take a breath, blood, or urine test," or say they start with a breath test, and you say, "No, I'm not going to take a breath test, but I will go take your blood test." Cop says, "No, I'm offering you a breath test." And you say, "Look, I want a blood test, breath test, blood test. Yes, huh, no, huh, yes, huh, no, huh." Well, what's going to happen ultimately is that the cop is going to say you refused the test that was offered. And there is a consequence under this notion of implied consent, which means driving is a privilege, not a right. So you're consenting to certain consequences, or you're actually consenting in advance to taking a test, but you still can refuse. Doesn't make any sense, trust me, but it does. That means there's a consequence, and the consequence in Ohio is you get something called an administrative driver's rights suspension, which means for refusing the test on a first offense OVI, you're going to have a 1-year automatic license suspension, 30 days of which you're not even eligible for driving privileges. Now later on, that can all change when you get to court. If you took the test and got a result above the legal limit in Ohio, that suspension is only 90 days. But here's the trick. They don't tell you. It's a whole other topic. But what they're not telling you is if you just go plead guilty, that 90 goes away. And in theory, the 1 year goes away. And then the judge gives you his or her own suspension, which lo and behold is typically 1 year anyway. So there's not a whole lot of consequence for refusing the test, but there is a consequence. Now, what I'm saying in the mix here is that there is a consequence for refusing the test. We don't get to choose the test that we want. So you have to take or refuse the test that is offered. Now, should you take a breath test? Should you take a blood test? Should you take a urine test? Call me on the side of the road. I'll be happy to answer that. Palmer Legal Defense. That's a nuanced question. But typically it's sort of backwards. It's like breath tests are sort of given or treated as the gospel, and they're probably the least reliable. Blood tests probably the most reliable, but they all have their flaws. They all have and urine maybe the least. Among the least anyway, but they all have their pros and cons. Either way, you don't have to take a test, and you don't get to choose the test that you take. Now, there's some exceptions. Let's say it's a second offense. Let's say you've been in trouble before, and you're still on probation, and the judge says to you, "All right, as a term and condition of your probation, you, Mr. Defendant, no good, rotten DUI defendant, you're never allowed to refuse a test. You have to take all tests, all chemical tests that are offered to you." And you refuse that, they're still not going to force you down or force you and tie you down, but it will be a violation of your probation. You'll have consequences for that in the first OVI. The other thing that we run into here in Ohio a lot is something called, the police often call them like no refusal weekends, where you refuse the test, then they go get something called a search warrant, and then drag you into the hospital and take your blood by search warrant. And that has been upheld. It doesn't mean that you should necessarily consent if you don't want to, but they're going to go get a warrant and take your blood. They have to have probable cause. So typically what happens is they call some judge in the middle of the night, wakes up and says, or he's probably on call anyway because he knows it's a no refusal weekend. And over the phone, he authorizes a warrant, or maybe they knock on his door. They've done that before. So it's a great question, and I could probably talk about this stuff for hours. If you want more on it, I do encourage you to check out the Lawyer Talk podcast DUI 360 series, because there's lots of this kind of stuff there. And what's funny about DUI law, and let's say this and I'll shut up about it, is that I often say it's about as complicated as it gets. We have like these nuanced administrative issues about driver's rights suspensions if you take a test or don't take a test. You have scientific issues about the reliability of blood tests, about gas chromatography, about urine tests, about breath testing. If you think a breath testing machine is a simple device, far from it. And then we have these often very complicated constitutional law issues about whether the police can pull you over, can they order you out, can they arrest you for DUI, what's probable cause, what's reasonable suspicion. I mean, there's lots going on with DUIs. And it's all intermingled with people's lives and what's going to happen to them with their job and at home with their insurance. So look, get a lawyer if you need a lawyer, if you're charged with OVI, and don't, no shame in it if you made a mistake, but get a lawyer anyway, get some help. If you got more questions, if you got your own question and or a topic you want me to cover, go to lawyertalkpodcast.com. Shoot me a question, or you can check us out on all the socials. Leave us a comment. There's a couple comments out there. We're going to get to it. We're going to address them right here at the round table. But for now, this is Lawyer Talk Podcast Q&A off the record on the air, at least until now. Hey, Steve Palmer here from Lawyer Talk. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Check us out, all our social media. Like, share, interact, ask your own questions. We're here for you.